Welcome everyone. Welcome to CEDA's Australia's Defence Future event. My name is Hamilton Calder and I'm the National Director. Wherever you are watching this around Australia or even around the world, in particular Australia, we'd like to to the country and pay respects to elders past, present. I'm coming today from the land of the Cardno people in Australia, but wherever you are, we acknowledge our traditional owners. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome, it's delighted to have Ministers Reynolds and Minister Price. Ministers, thank you very much for joining us today, and we will continue properly very shortly. It's also my great pleasure to acknowledge that CEDA as a national member-based organisation can't run events with digitally, face-to-face, or the research we do. Great support for our members. And today I'd like to acknowledge Cardno and very shortly I'll introduce John Large, who will be our facilitator today, but also to acknowledge PE Aerospace. They're our sponsors for our live stream event today, so thank you very much to both member organisations. Today's event is a wonderful opportunity to hear about Australia's defence future, and as I said, it's a great opportunity for us to showcase both ministers, but also to leave you on the hands of John Large, who's Asia Pacific Defence Director for Cardno. So John, over to you and a great event.
Thanks, Hamilton, for the kind introduction. Firstly, a warm welcome to our online audience, who should, by all accounts, number about 648, and a special welcome to our two ministers who are our keynote speakers today. As Hamilton mentioned, my name is John Large. I'm the Asia Pacific Director for Cardno, and I'm very pleased to be your facilitator for today's CEDA event, which is to talk about Australia's defence. Our guest speakers will be discussing the Australian Government's commitment to defence spending in the coming years and how the investment will enhance both capability and capacity, as well as providing significant economic opportunities to grow defence industry and strengthen our alliances. Cardno is pleased to be today's major sponsor, and this caps off a fairly long track record of working with defence across a wide range of infrastructure projects. Some of those of note include our involvement with the 26 sites across the Base Engineering Assessment Program, numerous infrastructure projects including the Enhanced Land Force project at Gallipoli Barracks, the North Queensland Midterm Refresh, and the Larrakia Defence Precinct. We're also very pleased to have been involved with the delivery of the One Estate Asset Management Framework, which was a major approach to realignment to asset management for the Estate Infrastructure Group. We're also working on some estate-based planning work at Garden Island, and related to that is the Captain Cook Dry Dock. We're also undertaking a range of environmental projects for defence, including major contamination works, particularly at Coonawarra, as well as the ongoing monitoring program for PFAS contamination at 3 defence regions. We're also undertaking a range of maritime works in the Pacific in support of the Guardian class rollout to those Pacific nations. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to remind viewers they can follow this, follow CEDA on Twitter at CEDA_news, and CEDA's mentioned that they'll be tweeting from today's event, and I would invite viewers to join the conversation at #defence. In terms of questions, I'd like to remind viewers that they can ask questions of the participants using Pigeonhole. The login is Defence Capitals. Details are on the live stream webpage. You will need to provide your name and company to get through the CEDA gate. So I'd like to hand over now to Senator, the Honourable Linda Reynolds, Minister for Defence, for her comments.
Well, thank you very much for Jonathan for that introduction, and also thank you, Hamilton, for the invitation to speak to CEDA today, and through you, welcome to your audience. These discussions, these economic discussions in particular, are very important as our nation now faces a health-induced global financial crisis but also now an increasing security crisis, or at least deteriorating strategic circumstances. So it is a very timely opportunity to have this discussion with you here today. Look, it is a real privilege to discuss our security challenges facing our nation. It is fair to say in the 15 months since I've been Defence Minister, it has not been short of issues to deal with for both myself and my friend and colleague, the Honourable Melissa Price, who is our Defence Industry Minister and who will be addressing you shortly. We've had a strategic review, which I'll talk about shortly. We've still got over 2,000 troops overseas during COVID, and we've had two very large domestic humanitarian disaster response activities here in Australia, the bushfires and also now COVID-19, which has made a very busy time for Defence. So what I'd like to start off talking to you about is about our strategic circumstances and about how the federal government is dealing with that. Since the release of the 2016 white paper, the strategic challenges that we had identified in the 2016 paper have accelerated faster than we anticipated back in 2016. Major power competition, military modernisation, grey zone challenges, and also not only the disruptive technological advances, but also how they're being adopted by militaries globally and particularly in our region. So all of these trends were accelerating and were very apparent before COVID-19 hit, but it's safe to say that COVID-19 is certainly accelerating these trends even further, and they are being exploited to some extent in our region. So the three things I'd like to have a talk to you about today are our plan to tackle these challenges, how the Defence Force is dealing, contributing to the COVID-19 response, and also how we are partnering with Australian industry, which is what Melissa will talk to you about in more detail. So first of all, the government's response to our security challenges. 15 months ago, when I became Defence Minister, I set three clear, but I think quite powerful objectives and strategic focus for Defence. The first one was our strategy, the second was capability, and the third is reform. We moved very, very quickly on my first priority, and that's strategy. And last month, the Prime Minister and I released a strategic update, the Defence Strategic Update document itself. And it sets out a very clear-eyed articulation of our geostrategic circumstances and also what we need to do as a nation to address those. And then in relation to my second priority, which is capability, we also released at the same time the 2020 Force Structure Plan. And the Force Structure Plan sets out the government's plan for capability investments that are required to deliver on the Defence Strategy documents. It's not a white paper, but it is a very significant update from the 2016 white paper. Some of the major changes that we made in that white paper is, the first one is that in 2016 we set three equally weighted goals for defence. That is for our territorial defence, regional defence, and more widely global defence. That was appropriate in a more benign strategic environment, but what we're seeing now in our region requires a much sharper focus. So what we've done is we have set three new objectives-based, effects-based objectives for defence, which is shaping, deterring, and also responding. So they're all now about the effects we need to generate for our nation's defence and not on geographic considerations. So firstly, to shape, and that is all about shaping our strategic environment. It's very much soft diplomacy focused. It's not about shaping any other nation, but what it is about is shaping the environment we want in our region, rules-based and sovereign respect. So it's all about encouraging the good behaviours and also ones to retain the environment that we want to live in. Secondly is to deter actions against Australia's interests, and that's keeping an increasing range of threats at bay from our nation, whether it's cyber, cyber threats, or more kinetic threats to our nation or to our troops as well deployed overseas. And the third, respond, is having the capability and the intent and also a credible willingness to respond if, God forbid, we ever get to the point where deterrence hasn't worked. We are also in this document unashamedly focusing on our immediate region across the Indo-Pacific, which goes pretty much from the subcontinent through ASEAN, Melanesia, and right across the Pacific. As part of this, we are sharpening our air, land, and maritime assets, but we have also introduced two new military domains, that is cyber and that is space. Both now reflect a very clear and immediate threat to our nation in a way that wasn't as apparent or in 2016. Importantly, not only is it important to get the strategy right and to get the capability plan to deliver that, but I also needed to secure the funding for that. So we have locked in the next 10 years of expenditure on defence, for the defence budget, and also for the defence capability, which is $270 billion, which fully funds what we had announced in the 2016 white paper. So that is now locked in, which is critically important for defence planning and also for Australian defence industry. A couple of other points, key points about the strategy itself is that the importance of our alliance with the United States remains our most important strategic partnership. And we also note the ongoing importance of the United States' role in our region, in particularly in the Pacific, in ensuring peace and stability over the last few decades. So that is certainly very much reaffirmed, and that it remains the bedrock of security in our region. It's also important to note that the strategic update is not aimed at any one specific country, and we do recognise the ongoing importance of Australia's bilateral relationship with China. And we also remain committed to working with all of our regional partners to advance prosperity and also security. But that said, we have always, and we continue to be consistent in raising concerns about developments that we believe are inconsistent with international law or may undermine the sovereignty of not only ourselves, but also regional friends. In relation to, that's the first two priorities, strategy and capability. And in relation to my third priority of reform, it is very clear to me, and I think all defence observers, that to deliver on this capability that our nation needs, defence must continue its reform journey to become more adaptive and also to fully align strategy capability and the delivery of that. So the next project that we now have well underway, led by our Associate Secretary for Defence, is a long-term transformational program that we're now putting together to make sure that we can adapt to technological change, that we can really deliver the projects, the 400 plus projects we now have underway, but also adopt spiral reform given the quick pace of technological change, which others are adopting. So that's the first thing in relation to defence strategy. Secondly, in relation to COVID-19 and defence's support for our national efforts, clearly COVID-19 is an active and unpredictable threat. It has certainly altered the economic trajectory of our region and our world, which has significant implications for our nation, not only economically, but also in terms of our security. And defence is certainly playing its part in our national response to COVID-19. And we've got 4 lines of effort or support. The first one is supporting our nation's health response, which is the most visible one publicly, with 3,400 ADF members now out on the ground right across the country. But we are supporting the economic response, which Minister Price will talk to you about shortly. The business of defence of our nation still continues, both here and overseas. As I said, with over 2,000 troops still deployed overseas. And also we are increasing our support to our regional neighbours, in particular through our Defence Cooperation Program, and supporting other defence forces assist in their own nation's COVID-19 response. We have been called upon to demonstrate great agility and also to use the wide range of skills that are inherent in defence in new ways. But I think, and I'm extremely proud of the way that Defence has done that. And Melissa will talk again shortly about how our economic objectives and our industrial work that Defence is doing is an integral part of our nation's recovery post-COVID-19. I've just got to say I'm extremely proud to be part of a government that is unashamedly backing Australian industry, and we have been doing so since 2016. For those of you who are keen observers of defence industry will know that we made defence a fundamental input to our military capability, and we have been undergoing significant structural and cultural change to bring in Australian industry. And that has never been more important and recognised as more important about building our industrial base here in Australia in a whole range of areas. But it is now important that we also identify and do more work on our sovereign industrial capabilities, again, which sits with Melissa. And COVID-19, as I said, has made that even more important. So in conclusion, we are experiencing very significant and profound changes in our geostrategic circumstances. This is at the same time we are experiencing an unprecedented economic shock. Both economic prosperity and national security are the two pillars that underpin any democracy, including our own. So we are, I think, in an unprecedented way, facing impacts on two of those fundamental pillars that supports any stable democracy. But it's not a time for panic, but it is a time for very clear-eyed and very focused and deliberate action. And this government is using all arms of our statescraft to shape and the world that we want to continue to be. And that is one that respects sovereignty of all nations, large and small, one that respects international rules and norms, and one that value peace and prosperity. So, ladies and gentlemen, I might conclude there and just say that is what lies at the heart of this government's defence strategic update and where we are taking the defence of our nation in today's most unsettled world. So thank you.
Thank you, Minister Reynolds. I'd now like to invite Minister Price to make her remarks. Oh, Minister, can you unmute, please?
Unmuted, sorry.
That's the only time I tell a minister what to do.
Okay, very sorry about that. I thought I was unmuted. So I should start again, I think, Jonathan.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I should start again. Yep. Okay. All right. So sorry, everyone, for being unmuted. Thanks very much to CEDA for organising. I do want to acknowledge TAE Aerospace and Cardno. We appreciate the engineering support of Cardno in the Defence Estate and Infrastructure Group space, and the specialist engineering support and investment by TAE Aerospace for Australia's F-35 fleet. Thanks to my WA colleague, Minister Reynolds, the very, very capable Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds. It's great to have her as a friend and a colleague. Thanks for her comments. Look, there are no doubt that there are incredible opportunities for both defence industry and the wider industry into defence across Australia. And as the Minister for Defence Industry, I'm responsible for the delivery of capability for the various platforms that we've committed to, but I'm also responsible to advocate on behalf of Australian businesses in projects and procurement, as well as Defence's large property portfolio. Many tens of thousands of Australians are already employed across the defence industry, and at least 15,000 companies and some 70,000 Australians are benefiting from our investment in defence. all too often, and I'm sure many of you have heard this that are on the line, that people say that manufacturing is well and truly dead in Australia. Well, what I say to them is that they're truly not looking closely enough at defence industry, or what I call defence manufacturing. And I think during the COVID period, we've all had our challenges, and from my perspective, and also from Minister Reynolds, we've all been working very hard at keeping the wheels of defence industry turning to make sure that we support Australia's economy. I said from the beginning of the COVID period that we need, as defence industry, we need it to be stronger, not weaker, and we needed to work on making sure we had the right frameworks in place so that we could build a robust and resilient defence industry. So my job has been to continue to back those small businesses to drive our economic recovery, and also just to deliver the world's best products and services for our men and women in uniform. And there's no doubt that we've been fostering much stronger ties between industry and government during the COVID-19 period to make sure we can develop and deliver and sustain those defence capabilities highlighted in the 2020 Defence Update and Force Structure Plan, as Minister Reynolds has referred to. And during COVID, we have consciously shifted gear to enhance the opportunities available to Australian business. We've explored and enhanced ways to better advocate and also to support local business. Myself and occasionally Minister Reynolds, when she was available, we've had regular teleconferences with defence industry CEOs, associations, state and territory defence advocates, and also together with the senior defence officials. And during those calls, you know, it could simply just be the government update of what has happened that week, but often it gave an opportunity for industry to talk about an issue that's confronting them. You know, clearly there's been issues with human resources and resources crossing over various state borders, and we've been able to resolve those issues one by one. It's been an extremely positive period for building that relationship between government and industry. And I think that we have created such enormous goodwill. So when I said I wanted us to be stronger, not weaker, I had no idea just how strong the relationship was going to be at the end. And of course, that relationship more than ever needs to be strong. One of the initiatives that we did right at the outset was we determined that Defence would pay its invoices as quickly as possible, particularly important for those companies who only have a small amount of defence work and relying upon non-defence work. So since late March, Defence has paid almost 190,000 invoices valued at some $14 billion, and of this more than $10 billion has been paid early. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate this is no mean feat when you consider how many thousands of invoices come into Defence each and every day, but I have no doubt that by doing that we have saved thousands and thousands of Australian jobs. So we're incredibly proud of that, and the early payment of invoices continues today. Since I've been in the portfolio, together with Minister Reynolds, we've been identifying those barriers that have been in place which are preventing the Australian SME sector from taking advantage of defence industry projects. Most recently, we've been working with the Department of Finance to update the guidelines supporting our Commonwealth procurement rules. Now, that may sound very dry, but that's incredibly important for Australian SMEs who are trying to get a foothold in defence industry. So the changes that we've made now mean that when you're considering value for money, there is now a specific focus on broader economic impact, like the employers working in Australia, what's their attitude to apprentices, creating export opportunities, but most importantly, you know, that they will also take into account developing Australian industry capabilities or industrial capacity, which of course is very important to Australia. So as you can imagine, it may sound very dry, and there'll be some people from the finance sector on the line, and they will probably say, well, that sounds pretty sexy to me, but to a lot of people it sounds very dry, but it's incredibly important that we've been able to change those guidelines. A couple of other barriers, as I would call them, are issues like the audit for what we call AIC, Australian Industry Content, and we've also been working on changing the contractual frameworks within the defence contracts for AIC. And with respect to the audit program, it's been incredibly important that we've been able to identify what the structure of that might look like, and we will involve independent auditors who will go on site, and they'll be having to look at the books of the various, when I say primes, I mean major contractors, to be able to investigate whether a prime is compliant with its AIC obligations. And of course, if a company is found not to be compliant, well, I think you can gather that there's probably going to be less likely that they will be involved in those future defence contracts. And I guess that's because future tenders, the company's performance on past obligations will be a factor. So there'll be a range of sticks and carrots in the audit program to ensure compliance with AIC, and that program will be released very shortly. And related to that is the work we've been doing around the contractual framework to make sure that there's the right amount of sticks and carrots. And for those who are on the line that are involved in law firms, and I myself, I'm an ex-construction lawyer, you will appreciate just, you need the structure of the contract right, that there's the right stick and carrot to encourage the right behaviour. So this has been the work that we've been doing since I've got in this role, and it's not always obvious to the public, the work we're doing, but I can guarantee you that the work with respect to audit and also the framework will make a significant difference to ensuring that Australian SMEs get every opportunity that they need. One other initiative that we've been focusing on is the CDIC. Some of you on the line will know who the CDIC is, but for those who don't, it's effectively the shop front for defence industry. And we've just recently completed a review of that, and together with Minister Reynolds, we'll consider the recommendations. But what we want is to have an organisation that represents defence, that's providing the best support for Australian SMEs in our defence industry, and also for those looking to get into defence industry. I'm a child of a mining town in Kalgoorlie, and I'm particularly interested in how the mining sector, who are involved in some form of infrastructure, whether they're making a widget or a railway line up in the Pilbara, how they can transition into defence industry, because I'm quite convinced that there are many others out there in the broader economy of Australia that could take advantage of defence industry. I'm also responsible for the defence estate and infrastructure, and I just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of just how significant our spend is on that. And the government is delivering some $23.6 billion across 155 active infrastructure projects nationally, and we're expecting to release a further $1.6 billion in capital infrastructure works this financial year. And they are also getting the benefit of early payment of invoices. And as you can imagine, if you're a small tradie who's got a lot of non-defence work, but you've got a little bit of defence work, I'm quite sure that we've kept them alive and kept food on the table for many of them. From the 1st of April 2020 to the 31st of July, Defence has engaged around 1,200 small businesses and 54 Indigenous businesses, with a combined value of some $359 million being injected into the economy. This is the equivalent of almost 6,500 Australians being employed in supporting our defence bases. So as you can see, it's quite significant. I just wanted to touch on, before I finish up, just wanted to touch on displaced aviation workers, just to give you some sense of just, the benefit of Australia's defence industry. And there's no doubt that the pandemic has changed many of the things that we all took for granted. And when travel restrictions were put in place in March, as you know, it did have a devastating impact on Australia's aviation industry. Virgin, going into voluntary administration, and although Qantas might be our #1 carrier, it was also hit hard, with some 20,000 employees across the country stood down almost overnight. And I just love this one story, and I just wanted to share it with you. Really pleased, Lursen Australia, some of you will know they're a shipbuilder, designer and manufacturer, and proudly a part of our naval shipbuilding enterprise. They're preparing to build 10 offshore patrol vessels, the Arafura class, for defence in Sydmic's big shed down at Henderson, which is in Western Australia. And as a significant customer of Qantas, Lursen provided Qantas with a list of possible shipbuilding contract roles based in Perth and Adelaide. And as a result of that, there was a Perth-based cabin crew member, a young man called Clarence Ong. He was appointed as Lurson's Australia's document control administrator on a set contract. And he's not the only aviation and manufacturing worker to have had the support of defence industry, and there's a number of defence industry players who've picked up some of these aviation engineers who've been displaced. So it's been interesting just to see people turning to defence industry at a time when people have lost their jobs. There's a lot of things that I can talk about, and I think I might leave it there, and hopefully there'll be some questions relating to defence industry and just the work that we're doing. So thanks very much to CEDA for the opportunity to talk today, and also to talk to your 648 people online. Thanks very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Minister Price. I'd now like to work through a series of questions, but to start the ball rolling, a question to both ministers, and it's in relation to the pressures the government's faced economically in terms of the response to clearly the bushfires, which were mentioned, as well as the COVID-19 response, in relation to and how those effects might be impacting the commitment to spending, and also how lockdowns and issues around border controls may affect the program delivery, not only infrastructure but also capability in particular. Perhaps if I could just get a comment from Minister Reynolds first.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'll take the first half of the question and I'll hand over to Minister Price for the second half of your question. Look, in short, in relation to funding, as I said, there's no point having a plan if you can't fund it. And this does require long-term funding. The bottom line to this project, or this whole program that we've initiated, is that we need the capability. And we are unashamedly now turning to Australian industry, who, as Melissa has said, is responding magnificently to this. And we have far more capability here than perhaps Defence had previously thought. So with the Defence budget, as I said, we've locked it in for the next 10 years, which does fully fund what we anticipated and projected in 2016. We had said that we would take defence expenditure up to 2% of GDP. We've now achieved that, but we have decoupled defence expenditure from GDP to make sure that we have funding certainty and it's not subject to fluctuations. So that's the first thing. And second point I'd make about defence expenditure is there's sometimes misunderstanding, and there's a sort of thought that it mostly goes overseas. Well, of our current defence budget, 30% of that goes into wages, both for the public sector, defence staff, and also our uniform staff. Another 30% of it goes into sustainment. The vast majority of that, so sustainment of bases and capability, upwards of, I think, 80% of that is spent and has a great multiplier effect through the Australian economy. And currently another 30+% goes into capability acquisition, where previously the majority of that did find its way overseas. But increasingly, as I've said, we are moving more and more of that back to Australia. So in 10 years, 40% of the total defence budget, which will be hitting over $80 billion a year, will be on capability. And we are increasingly having that money spent here. So we have a very clear plan to make sure that we use this money. And again, as I said, huge multiplier effect. We haven't previously measured that, but we have now got some longitudinal studies going so that we can actually demonstrate to the taxpayer of how this money is contributing to our economy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Just want to check that I'm not muted.
No, it's all good.
Look, as I mentioned in my address, one of the first things that we did was make sure that defence contractors were paid as quickly as possible, and then we built upon building the relationship. I think it's fair to say that the relationship between Minister Reynolds and myself and industry has, for anyone that's been in these roles before, I don't think I'm overstating it, has never been closer. And so as much as, there's been some devastating impacts across the economy with respect to COVID-19, this has been one of the upsides of COVID-19, that we've got much closer to industry, and long may that continue. We have created incredible goodwill to the point where we've got it's not to say that we don't understand the progress of projects and we don't understand schedule and time and cost. Of course we do. And Cdic, which is the responsible part of the department, they've really got their finger on the pulse. But what we're finding now is that there's a much greater openness to try and solve issues before they become a problem that we can't jump over. And that is what we've done. So with those weekly phone calls, that's just me. But within the department, they've set up special groupings of people that are responsible for just dealing with these issues as they have arisen. And as a consequence of that, we're not experiencing significant delays. Of course, there's the odd delay because we've had issues with people and materials coming into the country, obviously, from overseas, that will have an impact. But by and large, we've been able to overcome all of these issues. So we're just immensely proud of just what we've been able to achieve. And when we speak to our counterparts, in particular in the US and the UK, they are in a whole world of trouble with their defence industry programs. Whereas we're pretty much right on track. So we're really proud of it's not just what defence has done, but what industry has done. Industry has stepped up big time, even with the way that, a lot of the work they're doing there, it's a factory setting and there's people working alongside one another. So they've really had to work hard to make sure that they can still continue to keep the show on the road, notwithstanding the restrictions that have been put in place by COVID. So we're very confident that we're on track, but it's been a huge amount of effort on the part of everyone.
Thanks, Minister Price. I might stick with you for the moment. There's a question here from Andrew Dowse, who's asking, I guess, some information around the timing and nature of initiatives in the strategic update in terms of increasing sovereign industry involvement, Australian industry requirements, and I think importantly, at this time, the security of supply chains. So you could make a comment. And I know you mentioned sort of the, looking at capability around Australia for people in the Pilbara making, railway lines and so on, which is fantastic. I suppose it'll be how those things get drawn together, I think, is important. Yeah.
So thanks very much for the question. It's a very good question. And there's nothing like a pandemic to get people focused on what is it that we need to be self-reliant upon. And our language, of course, is what's the sovereign industrial capability that we need to make sure that we've got the capability to be able to defend our nation and to be able to provide the equipment that our men and women need in uniform. And there's policy around sovereign industrial capability, and we identified going back a couple of years ago what we considered to be our priorities at the time, and systematically the plans around those priorities have been developed. But I think it's fair to say that we've been moving towards a more broader discussion. If I think of sovereign industrial capability is the pointy bit. When you talk about Australian industry content, there's a lot to discuss with respect to who can do what, but the bigger question is, what do we want to be able to be built in Australia? And so there's a lot more work being done around that as we speak. But it is important that we identify very clearly, and the policy around 2016-17, I think that was a very solid piece of work. But I think what we're learning, and this is not something we just woke up during COVID, it's something Minister Reynolds and I have been very, very closely talking to many of our colleagues in the Defence Department around how often do you have to do that exercise. So, this is the work that's going on now. But, we've got a pretty clear view about what we need to do, but we must continue to refresh that work, and that's the work that's going on at the moment.
Thank you. Minister Reynolds, we haven't forgotten about you. This is a question for you. A question from Joey Armenti in regard to the role that Western Australia can play in the developing our defence capability in terms of potential for future bases in the West and also potentially in the Northwest. I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Joey. That's almost like a Dorothy Dix question for a West Australian senator, in fact, for two West Australian MPs. But West Australia is already making a very significant contribution to our nation's defence. We have almost half of the naval fleet based here at Fleet Base West. We also have the Special Air Services Regiment. We have significant Air Force capabilities, and also our basing and facilities, Exmouth and further north. So we, in recognition of not only just state and territory boundaries, but we do have a very ambitious Northern Australia agenda for infrastructure and also for force development. So that won't involve any new bases per se, but we are putting significant new resources into the north, and that includes in Western Australia at Curtin Air Base, Learmonth, at Yampi Sound Training Area, sort of, and down through to back to here in Perth at Henderson, and also Garden Island. So we have, as a nation, focused quite rightly on the Pacific, but we are a three-ocean nation, and the Indian Ocean itself is becoming increasingly contested, and we are looking at new relationships as well with India, with Indonesia, and others in the Indian Ocean rim to accommodate that. And West Australia is, but will keep increasingly play an important part of that. And just on that, we are, as I said, a three-ocean nation, and to our south, the Southern Ocean, Antarctica is also of great strategic interest to us, and also others. So we are looking very carefully sort of across all three oceans.
Thanks, Minister Reynolds. I'll stick with you again. Just a question in regard to building cyber, our defence cyber industry capability.
Yep.
And the question here is from Puneet, who's asking, will that be based onshore? I guess issues around retaining talent and providing the cyber governance to the nation. Is that something, do you see defence being a leader, a cyber leader within Australia in that regard?
Well, Jonathan, defence already is. And maybe if I just unpack that for some of the people who are online today, is that the Australian Signals Directorate sits within, it's an independent statutory body, but it sits within the defence portfolio. And we also have the Australian Cyber Security Centre within the ASD. And that is for a very good reason, because increasingly it is difficult to tell the difference between what is a safety issue, online issue for companies and for families, and also cyber attacks. Because if you attack a bank, if you attack a critical infrastructure company, they are attacks on our sovereignty and on our nation. And sometimes they're criminals, and sometimes they're state-based actors, or people who are copycatting state-based actors. So all of them, doesn't matter who the source is, they are threats to our nation and to our nation's sovereignty. So as part of the defence structure update, as I said, we've created a cyber and information warfare domain, and we are putting increasing resources into that. $15 billion over the next decade to significantly enhance our cyber and information warfare capabilities. And I recently announced what we call a CEDA package. The Prime Minister and I did. It's $1.35 billion, which to do a number of things. One is to significantly increase our engagement and support to industry, because this is not something that the federal government can protect the entire nation from. This really, it's got to start with individuals, with families, and what they do at home. And Australian companies need to step up far more in their own cyber security measures. But we do need greater workforces. I know that universities are now pumping out more cyber security experts, but this is an area of growing demand, and it will become increasingly so. So this is a threat in terms of a crime, but it is also a threat to our nation in terms of national security in the true sense of the concept.
Thanks, Minister Reynolds. Just back to Minister Price. Question from Flavio Macau. And we may have touched on this in regard to an earlier question. I guess how defence balances the supply chain between onshore and overseas suppliers. Particularly in terms of availability, as we might be having problems at the moment, and cost. Yeah.
So yes, I think I probably have touched on this a couple of times in my presentation, and also in an answer to another question. But there's no doubt that there will be some bits of equipment, bits of gear that are significant, with respect to perhaps some of our shipbuilding that will come from overseas suppliers, and we're very acutely aware of that. But if you just take the submarine program, for example, we're acutely aware that, we don't build submarines in Australia, but we want to build submarines in Australia. So how do we go about achieving that? So before COVID, we had some 60 young, keen engineers, most of them from South Australia, and I had the great pleasure of meeting most of them when I visited Cherbourg last year. And so the reason why they're there is because we're learning the know-how and know-why with respect to the design, so that when they come back to Adelaide and we start to have the in-country build of the submarines, that we've got the capability. So this is, it is relevant to the earlier question, because we have to continuously prosecute what is it we have to be good at here, you know, to be able to secure our supply chains, and that work has to be ongoing. But you have to also look at the bigger programs like the submarine, that it's not just what can we build, but what's the talent we've got here. I mean, if you just look at shipbuilding per se, there's around 4,000 people that are employed in Australia in shipbuilding. We're going to need 15,000. Now, I would say that's something that we should be as focused on as we are focused on where we're going to get the engines from, or the pumps from, or the widgets from. So all of these issues are critically important for our nation, but they are huge opportunities as well. And my job, together with Minister Reynolds, is to make sure we've got the skilled workforce, and that we're very focused on what is it exactly that we must be reliant upon ourselves, and make sure that we've got a plan in place. So far, we're identifying all of those things, and we must continue to refresh, because we just can't sit back and think we've done the job. So it's we're getting there, but it's a challenge. And the great news is that we've got a very responsive Australian industry. Industry is very interested in how they can get involved in the defence of our nation, and that's really pleasing.
Thanks, Minister. Just a follow-on question from Peter Vaughan in relation to the expenditure coming up over the next 10 years, and the questions regarding minimum obligations to be spent with Australian industry and Australian-owned companies. I mean, clearly it's a complex question, because you not only have, as you mentioned before, capability to actually do it, but also the capacity to do it. So I'm interested to, and I think Peter's question here is around whether there's any benchmarks that Defence look at in terms of that industry involvement.
I'm
not sure. You go, Linda.
Start off and then hand over, because it's a question for both of us. As I sort of mentioned briefly in my remarks, is this government is taking the position now is to default to Australian capability. We've done that very successfully on a state, for example, and some of the state programs that Minister Price is responsible for. So not only is the Australian industry content on a lot of that work now sort of up over sort of 90%, but the local industry content in terms of getting the workforce from the local communities around our bases is now over 80% as well. So where we can already identify the capability to do so, we are absolutely requiring Defence to engage more widely and to look a lot harder across Defence industry for capabilities. And unsurprising to many of us, they're finding it. But as Minister Price has said, there are some areas that we just simply do not have the IP or the capability here. So now that we have got a number of these large, particularly the shipbuilding programs underway, we are now looking for new opportunities. I recently, in fact, last week, I announced that for the Hunter class anti-submarine warfare frigates, while we have, for the first batch, we're getting an engine from the UK, we are now looking to see and to actively see whether there's an Australian fabrication company that can build it, because it is to a specification that's never been built here before, even for the oil and gas sector. So where we can, we're doing that. Over time, we are very good, as I said, in sustainment. So, for example, while we didn't have the capability to build the Collins class initially, we developed the capability to maintain and sustain them, both in South Australia and here in Western Australia. And in fact, over 90%, I believe, of the sustainment money for the Collins class is retained right here in Australia. So it's a journey, but what we are now doing in some of our sort of the earlier large contracts we are actually now going back, and I've done this with the submarines, is a minimum Australian content of 60%, and we're going through and just finalising the details of that now with Naval Group, so that we codify that. So we are increasingly doing that. And again, I'll sort of hand over to Minister Price, because that is some of the detail that she lives and breathes every day.
Yes, I think, you know, as Minister Reynolds said, we've for naval shipbuilding, we've seen between sort of 60 and 65. But what we're seeing, I think Lursen is a very good example that they're building the OPVs. They're a very good example. I think they're at about 68%. So as much as we've got some targets in the contracts, what we're actually seeing in reality is that they're exceeding that. And of course, we're very supportive of that. But one of the things that that Linda just touched on briefly with sustainment, and I think it's one of the best examples, the $2 billion contract that BAE and plus a number of other majors have got out at Henderson with respect to the ANZAC project. There's around 230 West Australian local companies that are involved in that project. And so what's very pleasing is the likes of Lursen and BAE, Cdic, etc. They're all looking locally. And I think, as I said, I was a little flippant, but you know, there's nothing like a pandemic to get people focused on what is the capability locally. And we've also seen that with the work around at the bases. You know, as I said, there's significant funding of the federal government into the bases. And what we've learned is that because there was restrictions with people going from one state to the other, that they've had to look locally. And so therefore these are, and the locals, and I'm just so proud of them, you know, the local plumber, the baker, that they've been able to prove that they're capable. And as a consequence of that, they're going to get more opportunities. But I want to make this point, Jonathan, that we're very supportive of Australian business, and we want some of them to transition into defence industry. But doing business with defence is not easy, and nor should it be. It is the defence of our nation, and it's important. So Australian industry and people who are advising them, and I'm sure there's many of those on the line, you need to step up, because there are opportunities there, but it's not easy. But there is no end to innovation hub grants. There's no end to grants that we give out with respect to research and to do with capability as well. So there's lots of funding out there to help people to get ready. And I just want to encourage people to think about how they can get involved with defence, but it doesn't happen overnight.
Thanks, Minister.
Jonathan, can I just add, just before we go, can I just add a great example of that is where we don't have the technology here is in the acquisition of the Joint Strike Fighters. That is an international collaborative program. And so while we didn't have the capability to design and to build it here, in fact, no one nation did, going into those collaborations are very important. And we now have over 50 Australian companies with over $1.7 billion worth of contracts that are now in the global supply chain for the Joint Strike Fighter. So that is also another avenue that we are pursuing, not just in Joint Strike Fighter, but in new collaborations where we can actually jointly develop subsea, air and surface programs.
Thanks, Minister Reynolds. We're just about out of time in terms of questions, but I wanted to leave a minute each for both of you just to outline your key priorities for the coming year, and particularly in relation to defence industry. So perhaps we start with you,
Minister Reynolds.
Look, thanks very much, Jonathan. I'd say that my key priority now is to ensure that our troops are still safe, and particularly COVID safe, because they are serving on the front line, not only domestically here, but overseas in many of the globe's COVID hotspots. It is also about ensuring that we can keep supporting the COVID-19 response here in Australia, given that we are almost coming up to, again, the national disaster season for our own nation, which will again put concurrency pressures on our forces. But again, as I said at the beginning, it's now really knuckling down and focusing on how we actually set defence on a truly transformative journey, so that we can actually deliver what we need to deliver, not only for our nation's economy, but particularly for our nation's security, and also to provide that reassurance that our security umbrella does for our region as well. So a full hand of issues to deal with over the next 12 months again.
As expected, I'm sure. Minister Price.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to CEDA once again. Number one priority, keep the cost and schedule on track for the projects that we've got. Secondly, to make sure we've clearly articulated and we know what are our sovereign industrial capabilities and drive the plan for that. It's not enough just to know what they are. You also have to drive the plan to make sure you have created it. And I think finally, just to increase the number of Australian SMEs that are in our defence industry supply chain. Lots of opportunity, as I said. It's not easy, but it's worth the effort.
Thank you very much. And to both ministers, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the viewers and also CEDA. And I think for me, some of the key messages that you've brought out today is really the importance of the 2020 strategic update and that plan and how we need to be able to respond rapidly to the changing environment, security environment. And I think on top of that, then we've got all those challenges around COVID-19 and what that brings. And I think the opportunity for industry is clear that we need to respond to that in a way that can enhance not only the capability, our own onshore capability, but also ensure that we have a viable and long-term defence industry in Australia. So that brings a close to the proceedings. I'd just like to advise the audience that you can continue to post additional questions to Pigeonhole for the next 15 minutes. CEDA will post selected responses in the post-event email. So that means, ministers, I'm sure that there'll be some homework for you or your staff. And the post-event email will also include a link to the recording of this live stream and any speaker presentation. So I think we're a little bit ahead of time, so I'll give you both back 4 minutes of your day. And once again, thank you very much. It's been a really informative and enjoyable presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much.
CEDA. Thank you.
Thank you.